finally established the fact that we finished up talking about this absorption rate. And I'm going to try to get the lights down in the front a little bit here so you guys can really see this. So we talked about the fact that insulin, this hormone insulin, can really determine how it is the cells deal with the nutrients in the bloodstream. And so if you consume a fast absorbing meal, causes the blood sugar to go up really, really fast, causes a strong insulin signal, which can lead to a lot of fat storage and a rebound hypoglycemia. And that's not a good thing. And then we talked about the fact that slow absorbing foods, we talked about these slow absorbing foods mostly with regard to fiber. So we talked about the difference between refined and flour, for instance, and whole grain. But then these slower absorbing foods, blood sugar goes up more slowly, and consequently the insulin signal is slower and weaker, and we get more utilization of the blood sugar for immediate energy, and then storage in the form of glycogen, which is not to say that you can't store sugar as body fat, convert sugar into body fat if you eat only slow absorbing foods. It's just that you're not going to do it to the same extent. So in any case, the glycemic index then is kind of a quantification of the rate at which the glucose from the food is absorbed into the bloodstream. And so as a result, it can be used as one indication of whether or not it's going to be healthy for you, but it is for sure not the only indication. It's just kind of giving you an idea if this food is going to absorb into the bloodstream and raise blood sugar quickly or slowly. So generally speaking, foods have, it's not just me.
No.
In general, foods have a lower glycemic index if they're high in fiber, as we discussed, if they're high in protein, and also if they're high in fat. So this is why I say the glycemic index is used as an indication of how quickly a food gets sugar from the food gets into the bloodstream, and that's one indication that food is healthier for you. But glycemic index is not the be-all and all of the health value of food. Why? Because we can take an absolute, crap food nutrient-wise, pure amylose, pure starch, take like a white bagel, devoid of really any nutritional value, very empty calories, and it's going to be very high glycemic index. Actually, if we look up here, let's see, a white bagel, there we go, glycemic index of about 72, so pretty high glycemic index. We can slather that white bagel with a bunch of saturated fat, just basically smear butter on it, and all of a sudden it's going to have a low glycemic index, but all we've done is add hard, unhealthy, saturated fat on top of our white flour. So just the fact that we have a low glycemic index does not mean we have a healthy food. However, healthy foods have low glycemic indices. So it works one way but not the other. But in any case, you can see that, of course, some of the things that you would expect, very sugary, very starchy things, are in the high glycemic index. Jelly beans, white rice, things like that. Some of the things that you would expect to be in the low glycemic index, things like whole grain bread, a lot of fruits, brown rice. So there's brown rice versus white rice, and that's the presence versus absence of the fiber, which is slowing down your digestion because it's, basically just frankly interfering with the digestive enzymes and the enzymes that help with absorption of sugars. All right. Just because a food is touted as a health food does not mean that it's healthy. We've talked so many times about how marketers try to convince you of things, and they may or may not be accurate in their statements. Notice tofu-based frozen dessert like tofuti or whatever, often billed as a health food, better for you than ice cream, whatever. Usually these quote-unquote healthy ice cream substitutes, all they've done is they've removed a lot of the fat, they've upped the sugar, because when we take the fat out of the food, as we discussed when we talked about low-fat diets, you have to increase the sugar for the food to still taste good to people. And tofu frozen dessert has the highest glycemic index of any food that I can actually find. I'm sure you probably find one really, really do a lot of testing that has a higher glycemic index, but that's the highest I could find doing a truncated survey. All right. So we've got a lot of information now about food and diet and nutrition, so how the heck do you put all this together, especially because so many of the pieces seem contradictory? On the one hand, we've got, well, USDA, and yet here's watermelon, which is definitely unhealthy food that nevertheless has a high GI. So, glycemic index is one indicator, but again, it's not the all and all. How do you pick foods that are healthy? So again, as I said at the end of chapter 8, you can look at yourself, very reductive in a sense, it's just kind of a big beaker in which you're running chemical reactions. And if you know how these reactions work, and now at this point you really do know how a lot of them work, if you know how these reactions work, you pick the ones you want to happen, and you provide reagents for those reactions. You want to build muscle, whether or not you want to get both, you definitely want muscle because it keeps your body moving. You want to build new tissue. You want to provide for the processes that take place in your cells for structural and functional proteins. Therefore, you need to eat protein. You want to make sure that you have enough fat in your body and in your diet to keep your hormone levels stable, to get the vitamins that you need. So, obviously you need to eat some fat, but we know that some fats are healthy and some are unhealthy. You need carbohydrate because glucose is the #1 favorite fuel of your brain, and you need carbohydrate for the other cells as well. So you've got to eat carbohydrate, but we know there's healthier carbohydrate and less healthy carbohydrate. If you don't want a reaction to take place, you don't want your blood sugar to go shooting up and then have rebound hypoglycemia and have a lot of sugar to fat conversion, then don't provide the reagents for that reaction. The best quality reagents all around are going to be your high quality carbohydrate in fruits, vegetables, and whole grains. Lean protein, that is either vegetable protein or protein from animals that are low in fat or low in fat or minerals. And unsaturated fats, trans fat and saturated fat are both parts unhealthy. You need fat in your diet. All right? So again, glycemic index. There are a lot of diet books and websites that make a lot of glycemic index. And the thing is, a low glycemic food could be a high quality food. Lots of, in fact, most high quality foods have low glycemic index. But there are a lot of crappy foods that have low glycemic index. You definitely don't want to be eating nothing but full fat Ben and Jerry's, and yet it has a very low glycemic index. A triple cheeseburger, basically a cheesy heart ball, is going to have a low glycemic index. So that is not the complete determinant. All right, then there's the other issue, and that is psychology. Any diet, and again, let's go back to the online lecture. I want to remind you that, I want you to remember that diet shouldn't mean what you do to lose weight. Diet should mean what you do to cut fat and gain a lot of muscle right before XYZ happens. Diet should mean this is what you eat and drink on a regular basis. Diet should be the sum total of what it is that you put in your body to kill your chemical reactions. So in any case, our diets have to satisfy us. They have to contribute to our well-being, our humanity, our cultural experience, our social experience. We can't spend our whole lives doing nothing but evaluating every second of the day. Is this food healthy? Is this food going to overall contribute to my level of well-being? We have to at some point make really good choices, and then some things that you just simply avoid on a different basis. Some dietitians, some nutritionists say go with like a 90%, 10% rule. 90% healthy foods, 10% whatever makes you happy. But even that, people sit around and wonder, well, have I eaten 90%? Don't overthink it. Make mostly healthy choices, and then enjoy the ice cream or whatever. All right, so we eat all this stuff, and we get all these calories, and we do a bunch of things with those calories. And so far, the things we do with those calories have been left kind of nebulous, so let's talk about them at this point. What is it we do with all this energy that we take in when we take in food? So caloric expenditure. There are several different kinds of caloric expenditure subcategories. In other words, we spend calories on lots of different things. The first one is RMR, resting metabolic maintaining everything you do that doesn't involve moving. It's the calories you burn in a coma. Your resting metabolic rate is different than the resting metabolic rate of everybody else in this room. Your resting metabolic rate depends on a number of factors. It depends on your age. To a certain extent, the older you get, the fewer calories you burn, but of course the very, very young, infants and children don't burn as many calories as young adults. So all of you who are in your early 20s, your resting metabolic rate is the highest it's ever going to be based on age. Gender. If you are a guy, maintaining your body just takes more calories than it takes to maintain a female body. That's partly due to hormones, largely due to muscle mass. It takes a lot of energy to maintain muscle, even when that muscle isn't doing anything. Your body composition, for the same reason that masculinity causes you to burn more calories at rest, your body composition. If you're very muscular, you burn more calories at rest than if you're less muscular. This is one of the reasons that if you've ever joined a gym or gotten a trainer and said, I want to lose weight, they're not necessarily, at least not if you know what they're doing, going to just stick you on the treadmill and say, run those calories off. Instead, they're going to put you in the weight room at least 2 days a week. And the reason is you want to build muscle, because muscle burns 15 times as many calories as fat when it's just sitting there. All right? So body composition affects that as well. Again, resting metabolic rate does not include the calories that you burn when you're moving around. It doesn't include the calories that you burn during exercise. It's just the calories that we burn in a coma. And for most of us, it accounts for about 70% of the daily calories we burn. Obviously, if you're in a coma, it's going to account for almost all of the daily calories you burn. If you are in the Tour de France or the Olympics, it's going to account for a much smaller percentage of the calories you burn, because you're going to be burning so many calories doing exercise. But this is assuming that you're a normal person who, walks to and fro and occasionally works out. You cannot figure out exactly your resting metabolic rate unless you go in for very fancy resting metabolic rate tests. But if you're curious what your resting metabolic rate probably is, item number one for women is probably somewhere in the neighborhood of 1,000 to 1,400 calories. And for men, it's somewhere between 1,500 and 2,000 calories for almost everybody. But you can go over and you can approximate it using these formulas if it makes you happy. And I just put those there. I'm not going to leave this slide up long enough for you to sit here and do this now, but you can always do it later if you're curious. These, again, these are approximations because while they take into account body size, gender, and age, they don't take into account body composition. So a 150-pound guy who's 22 years old and is built like a rock is going to have a higher resting metabolic rate than a 150-pound guy who's 22 years old and is very, very flabby and has very little muscle. Second place calories go, but this is not a big one. About 10%, 5 to 10% of the calories in the food we eat go right into digesting that food, strangely enough. It takes energy to burn our food, break our food down. It's called the thermic effective food. Thermic effective food is highest for proteins, it's lowest for fats. This may be one of the reasons that, again, if you've ever talked to a nutritionist or joined a gym and got nutrition advice, they say eat lots of protein. Protein is a couple things. First of all, it helps you build muscle, which typically trainers are also trying to get you to do by putting you in the weight room. But the other thing about protein is for every calorie of protein that you eat, you're really only getting about 9/10 of a calorie. For every calorie of fat you eat, you're getting just about that whole calorie of fat. All right? So thermic effective food, and you do put a little bit of energy into digesting your food every day. Physical activity, energy expenditure. This actually subdivides into two categories, exercise and non-exercise. Here we'll talk about non-exercise physical activity, energy expenditure. It turns out that if you're a fidgeter, you burn more calories than someone who sits still. People who tap their pencils, tap their feet, wiggle around, walk around instead of stand still, just burn more calories than those who sit very still. The sum of non-exercise and exercise physical activity energy expenditure is about 20% of the calories that you burn in a day. So and here's how that breaks down. Let's say you have a woman who burns about 2,000 calories a day. In all likelihood, about 1,400 of those calories are resting metabolic rate. About 200 of those calories are burned just in digesting her food, and about 400 of those calories are burned during an hour of exercise. All right, so this is for an average individual who's exercising about an hour a day. 45 minutes an hour a day. Again, this can vary tremendously. It can vary day to day, it can vary individual to individual, because obviously it's just going to depend on what you're doing every day. So these percentages are not set in stone. These are just kind of to give you an idea. Health experts, dietitians, nutritionists, physicians, they all have different opinions on what we should be eating, what kind of diet is healthy. You find a lot of dissent as to whether we should or should not be taking supplements, whether we should be eating more protein or less protein. There's all kinds of dissension in the ranks, but everybody agrees on one thing, and that is Americans spend too much time sitting on our tails. We are too sedentary. A survey from the late 90s showed that it was less than a quarter of adults in the U.S. who were engaging in vigorous exercise for 10 or more minutes 3 days a week. 10 or more minutes 3 days a week. Less than a quarter of us. What are we supposed to be doing? Anybody know what the recommendations are? 30 minutes? It's at least 30 minutes, and the guidelines keep changing. 3 days a week, 5 days a week, every day. At least 30 minutes. Real interesting study that came out just about a month or two ago that actually showed that overall risk of mortality decreased not so much with the total volume of exercise, but the intensity of exercise. So that if you work out really, really hard, 30 minutes most days, that's actually better for you overall in terms of reducing your risk of dying from whatever cause than working out for an hour or 2 hours every day or most days. So that's kind of an interesting thing. It's hard to take a single study and make a generalization or a broad sweeping recommendation on the basis of it, but lots and lots of work still being done in exercise. Yeah?
I've heard that let's say that, for example, you go on a treadmill, right? You go on an easy pace. But there's a certain amount of time before it starts to, before your body starts to actually
Sure. Absolutely. Okay. So if you're on a treadmill, it takes a little bit of time for your for the exercise to start affecting you. That's true in a couple different ways. The first way in which it's true is that when we get on a treadmill, and we'll talk about this later in the lecture, the first thing you're going to burn is you're going to start burning sugar. If you're interested in burning fat, which almost everybody is, you actually have to keep working out for a while, maybe 10 minutes or so, before your body decides to kick it into gear, getting those fat stores mobilized. The human body is incredibly lazy. We're lazy in our brains, we're lazy in our cells. It's a good thing. It's evolutionary. It's what kept us from running around in circles like lunatics, burning calories freakishly and needlessly when there wasn't a lot of food. We have a tendency to sit when we can, and our cells never engage in chemical reaction they don't have to engage in. So rather than mobilize precious fat stores, which are hard to come by if food is scarce and hard to replenish, we mobilize the sugar stores that are easier to replenish, easier to come by, and we only start using the fat when we have to. But the other thing too is, just as with any muscle, I mean, if I go into the gym and I do 2 little curls with a 10-pound weight, that's not going to do anything overall for building biceps muscles. Same thing, if I have my heart start beating faster and harder for just a short period of time, that's not going to change the health of the heart muscle much. But you do curls for a while, or you work that heart muscle for a while, and all of a sudden you're increasing fitness. So there's 2 different aspects to that. All right, does that make sense to you? Yeah. All right. All right. So almost nobody is getting enough exercise, but 60% of which also shows that it does not need to be continuous every minute, which means, the working adult who has time to walk 10 minutes to work, walk 10 minutes at lunch, and then has a 10-minute walk home, that's their 30 minutes. So that's actually kind of a nice research finding for people who are trying to fit exercise into a hectic schedule. Exercise, what does it do for us? Well, first of all, it helps to shift the caloric balance toward the negative, meaning it helps us burn more calories than we take in, which is going to help us either lose or maintain weight, depending on how negative that caloric balance is. It helps maintain health, particularly cardiovascular health. The heart is a muscle. It needs to be exercised. The heart does not work very hard just sitting in a classroom, sitting at your desk, as the heart is just sort of lazily pumping blood around. It doesn't work the heart very hard. But also, we've talked about other things like the fact that women, for instance, start losing bone density after age 30. And exercising helps to keep hormone levels higher, growth hormone and testosterone, which increases the density of female bones, and males too benefit. Increased muscle mass, increased bone density from exercise. Staves off the effects of aging, literally, which is probably not something most of you are worried about at this point in your lives, because most of you are probably still comfortably convinced that you're never going to get ill. But remember, at this point in your life, you're building the bone density, you're building the muscle density that's going to carry you through your adulthood. And by the time women hit menopause, and by the time guys hit about 60 and that testosterone level starts falling, it's pretty much all downhill from there in terms of building bone and building muscle. So you want to have a nice bone density and muscle mass. But when you hit that time, in order to keep it from falling and breaking your hip, it's not good. All right, lots of other health benefits associated with exercise. Exercise is just good for you. Bottom line. Let's keep talking about exercise a little bit longer. With regard to exercise, a lot of us kind of get into the mindset that the only reason to exercise is to burn the calories so we can justify eating cheeseburger or the whatever, poison. We get really hung up on what's called the direct effect of exercise, and that is to say the number of calories that you burn during a given exercise session. And if you go to the SRC and you hop on the treadmill spits out numbers at you. How many calories have you burned so far in your workout? The bad news with this direct effect, the calories that a machine tells you you burned, is it seems really small. Now you can go in there and you can be working darn hard for like an hour, and the machine may only say you burned about 400 or 500 calories, which isn't even the number of calories in a single McDonald's. I've got more bad news for you. Those machines are notorious for overestimating. They always tell you you burn more calories than you actually have, unless you are a huge, muscly guy who happens to be running on the treadmill. If you are anyone other than a huge, muscly guy, especially if you're a relatively slender female, the machines overestimate by as much as 30 to 40%. So it's pretty dismal if you actually just look at the direct effect. I mean, for an hour you can run, this is males in blue and females, you can run at 5.2 miles an hour, which is a pretty comfortable jog, and you'll have burned only 600 calories if you're an average guy, only about 456 if you're an average woman, and that's running for an hour. That's a long time to spend on a treadmill. But the good news is the direct effect of exercise is not at all the calories that exercise burns for you. So here's the thing. Not only is exercise healthy in a lot of ways that have nothing whatsoever to do with calorie burning, it's good for your heart, it's good for your bones, it's good, all these other ways. It also causes you to continue burning calories even once you are off the treadmill, so to speak. After you exercise, your resting metabolic rate goes up, and it goes up for as many as 24 hours. Has anybody, Arizona's a good place to experience this. Anybody had the experience of working out, you get done with your workout, you go take a shower, you get out of the shower, and you're still sweating? Yeah? That is because your body is literally running hot. You are literally burning more calories standing there after your shower than you would be burning if you'd been standing there and had never exercised. You burn more calories for as much as a day after besides the fact that muscle burns more energy than fat when it's just sitting there, another reason trainers like to get people into the weight room is that weightlifting has a particularly high post-exercise increased metabolic rate. More so than if you run, more so than if you swim. If you go and lift weights, you're going to burn more calories proportionally than you would if you've done another exercise and for a longer period of time. All right? And that's just simply because when you weightlift, you do a lot of damage to muscle tissue. And the body works really, really hard to repair that damage. It's very costly energetically for the body to repair muscle damage. Now, muscle damage is not something we want to do if our job is to keep away from saber-toothed tigers. Because if you did a really cramping leg workout as a cave person and then got chased by a tiger the next day, you would have one of those, like slow motion, kind of thing. And it's very, very hard to move quickly the day after a really hard muscle workout. So you don't want to tear up muscle if you're trying to stay away from prehistoric mammalian threats. But if your goal is to burn as many calories as possible, then tearing that muscle is a really great way to go about doing that.
I don't know if this is like for everybody, but sometimes when I work out really hard and my legs are just killing me, they usually don't feel better until I start doing that same exercise again. Is it related to this at all?
It is not related to this, but that's a very typical phenomenon for most people when you work out. So let's say you go in and you do a really hard leg workout, and then maybe your legs are shaking a little bit as you're on your way to the shower, right? And maybe you're a little bit sore that night, but the next day your legs are killing you, right? You can't move, and they're really, really swollen, and they're really tight. Basically, that swelling, that tightness, and that pain the next day, what you're feeling is inflammation and chemicals called prostaglandins that are responsible for triggering the body's repair system. So the body's working really, really hard to fix all the tearing of the muscle that you did when you forced the muscle to do more than it was ready to do when you tore up muscle fibers, which is exactly what you were trying to do. The body's going to rebuild, and it's going to rebuild stronger. So that's why it hurts more later. Now, if then on the third day afterwards, you go in and you do a light leg workout. If you're trying to do a heavy one, your legs would still be a little weak. But if you do a light leg workout or something like it on the treadmill and do some walking, that soreness will start to go away. And that's because as you work those muscles, you are dilating the blood vessels that carry blood to those muscles. You're bringing in fresh blood, and it's flushing out those prostaglandins and cytokinins and irritating chemicals. And it's basically just literally getting rid of the chemical messengers that are causing the inflammation and making you sense pain. So, yeah, absolutely, it's a great thing to kind of get rid of some of the soreness and stiffness. All right, so exercise. Again, there are two effects. There's actually a third. There's the calories you burn during exercise. There's the calories you burn for the approximately 24 hours after exercise. And then there's the calories you burn because when you exercise, you increase your muscle mass. And muscle burns more calories than fat, even when it's just sitting there. And that effect can be pretty significant. The increased muscle mass is actually the single most significant effect of exercise because it's ongoing. It doesn't last only while you're working out. It doesn't last only for 24 hours afterwards. It lasts no matter what you're doing, whether you're sitting, driving your car, working out, no matter what you're doing, continually for as long as you maintain that muscle. So it's a pretty huge effect. All right, let's say that we want to get more out of exercise than just burning calories, which is good. Exercise does a lot of things besides just burn calories. Let's say we're interested in the health effects of exercise. Well, there are a couple different kinds of exercise, and these are probably terms that you may remember back from like high school gym class. They even still have that. How many people had gym in high school? Wow, I'm so impressed. I thought that was kind of going the way of the dodo. All right,
It's not required.
it's not required. So you guys just took it like elective?
Mine was required.
It's required at my high school.
Really?
1 year.
1 year?
Mm-hmm.
You just graduated?
My high school wasn't required.
Wasn't required. Wow. What about little kids? Do little kids have to take gym class?
I think that's like
Yeah.
like PE class.
PE.
It was like twice between
general is to work it in the aerobics zone. The aerobics zone is a heart rate at which, basically the bottom of the aerobic zone is a heart rate at which the body begins building up metabolic waste products. There are a couple different ways to determine the aerobic zone. You can determine it very technically using testing, and what you basically do there is you take somebody and put a mask on them so that you can tell how much CO2 they're breathing out, and by measuring the amount of CO2 that they're breathing out relative to what the heart rate's doing and so forth, you can determine exactly the aerobic zone. But that's not very practical for most people who want to go out and exercise in the aerobic zone to improve cardiovascular health. You're not going to have somebody test your aerobic limits. You can get a rough idea of your aerobic limits by using the equation. Max heart rate is 220 minus your age. So let's say you're 20 years old. Your max heart rate theoretically is about 200 beats per minute. That's the fastest you would expect your heart to beat if you had a heart monitor on and you were running from a saber-tooth tiger. You'd expect to see 200, all right? Some people are genetic freaks. They might hit, if you're 20 years old, they might hit 220. They might only hit 180, but most people who are 20 are going to be right around 200 beats per minute for max. And you can only stay at that max heart rate for a very short period of time. The aerobic zone is going to be 65 to 85% of your max heart rate. So again, assuming that you're 20 years old and your max heart rate is 200, you'd be looking at anywhere from about 130 to about 170. Anywhere 130 to 170 is going to be your aerobic zone. If, however, you want something that, first of all, is based on how you feel, and for that reason, it can be a little bit more individualized and accurate for some individuals than the equation. But also, it's just really, really easy in the gym rather than taking your pulse continually or trying to hold on to the heart rate you use on the treadmill as you run. You're in your aerobic zone if you can talk, but you can't sing. And here's the idea behind this. If you can sing, you're getting so much air that your body doesn't need you to breathe continually. To sing, we have to be able to do long exhalations. And do a long exhalation, that means you're not taking a breath regularly, right? If you're working in your aerobic zone, your body needs more oxygen than you need just sitting around. So you can't sing because you need more air than that. But if you can't even talk, or you can only talk in short bursts, it means you're having to put a lot of focus on just getting air in, as much air as possible. If you're having to get as much air as possible in your body, you are above or outside your aerobic zone. So that's one of the quick and dirty, easy little tests to see in the gym whether you're in your aerobic zone. That basically means you are strengthening your heart muscle, building bone density, building muscle density, getting a lot of benefits of exercise. Besides building the heart muscle, building muscle density, and building bone density, you also keep your arteries clean. You reduce your risk of stroke. You reduce your risk of heart attack. You increase your HDL. Remember, exercise is, aside from booze, the best way to increase your HDL. Sad study that came out in the Journal of the American Medical Association today. Made me sad. No, but again, we can't read too much of any one study. But this study shows that for women, breast cancer risk goes up by like 15% even with low alcohol consumption, like during the day. So you don't have to weigh things like, and that's true for men too, cancer risk definitely goes up with alcohol consumption. And so with alcohol, you're weighing cardiovascular benefits versus toxicological issues if you're drinking a fair amount, cancer issues if you're not drinking that much. And there are benefits and drawbacks to everything. But in any case, exercise does not increase your risk of cancer. It does your health. It enhances blood flow. We're talking about getting rid of muscle soreness after working out by getting the blood flowing. You can increase your mental ability. If you have a test, one of the best things you can do is exercise after you study or exercise in med study. It gets the blood flow in your brain, wakes you up, activates your immune system, increases your ability to pay attention. Great stuff. All right. Here's another thing exercise does. If it's aerobic exercise, it helps you burn fat stores. And most Americans have fat stores to burn. Most of us want to burn fat stores. Okay, yeah, no, that's it. And a lot of people say, you know, warm up, exercise lightly, and then stretch in order to get the most benefit from it. Yeah.
Are there any studies that have shown correlation between stretching and, I guess, the muscle mass of calories?
It's a great question. Any studies that correlate stretching to muscle mass and your ability to burn calories? I do not know the answer to that question. I have never seen any, but I've never looked hard for them either. If you think about it, it's reasonable to suppose that if you stretch regularly and keep your muscles loose, you're going to have just better biomechanical balance. Say, for instance, anybody a runner? Who's a runner? A couple of runners. Okay. I'm a runner too. Runners have notoriously tight back bodies. Our backs are tight, our rears are tight, our hamstrings are tight. I don't mean tight toned, although for some runners they are. I mean tight like you can't touch your toes, right? Do you runners find that? Okay. We're notoriously unbalanced, partly because a lot of runners do not do a good job of stretching. We like to just get out there and run. But also because running causes us to not so much move, but just hold stiff a lot of the back of the body, especially through the rear and the back, and then reflects in the hamstrings in a way that just really tightens and shortens them. Runners tend to run faster and more efficiently if we actually take the time to stretch. So in that sense, you can certainly improve your running. I don't know if you burn more calories, but you certainly improve your running and you decrease your likelihood of injury with the IT band syndrome and piriformis pain and the shin splints and stuff like that if you stretch. All right? So in any case, aerobic exercise, we have two possible fuels. The first fuel, and this is kind of a really lazy chemical equation up here. The reason I wrote this out in a very lazy way, fat plus X, however many O2, gives us Y, CO2, and Z, H2O, and energy. I didn't put any stoichiometric coefficients in there because depending on the kind of fat, how much CO2, how much O2, how much H2O, that all, you know, it varies. It's a big type of fat. But suffice it to say, and this is the point, fat burns in O2, which is oxygen that we breathe in, to give us CO2 and H2O and energy. Sugar also burns in O2 to give us CO2 and H2O and energy. So aerobic exercise literally means with air, with oxygen, all right? And as long as we have oxygen, we can burn either fat or sugar. Now, once the body figures out we're going to be doing something for a while, more than just a few minutes, it definitely wants to switch over to using stored fat as opposed to using glycogen. It's faster and lazier to get to the glycogen, so it does that at first. But eventually it's going to switch over to the fat just because we've got most of us on the order of tens of thousands of stored calories per fat, only about 2,000 or so stored calories of glycogen. So we want to use the fat. The other thing is the amount of energy we get out of burning fat is way more than the amount of energy we get out of burning carbohydrate per gram burned. So in any case, during aerobic exercise, the majority of the calories you're going to burn are going to be fat calories, and that's going to help improve body composition. Yeah.
Can you, after you burn all of the fat in your, or your stored fat, I guess, can you burn protein? I heard that you can, but...
Yeah, you definitely can. Now, unless you're starving, you're not going to burn all of your fat. People who are starving do start utilizing protein, breaking down protein. But let's just say, for instance, that let's say your fat stores are so low that as you're exercising, you're burning fat, you can start to break down protein as well. It's definitely possible. And it's one of the reasons that endurance athletes who are very, very low body fat to begin with, and who are then going to be going and burning a lot of calories, they try to replenish a lot of those calories, about a third of them usually, as they're burning them, in order to keep from having too much protein breakdown. Well, the other thing, though, is that the whole thing's confounded. It's hard to measure because you expect protein breakdown during exercise because you are damaging muscle. That's part of what exercise does. It breaks down muscle. And that's one of the reasons it helps us build muscle. So on this last slide, then, start burning fuel. Notice we burn fat and oxygen, we burn carbohydrate and oxygen. What happens if you're not getting enough oxygen? So you're out on the track and you're walking, you're breathing easily. You're clearly getting enough oxygen. If you weren't, you would breathe harder. So then you start jogging and you start breathing a little bit harder, but you're breathing easily and you can chat with your running partner. You're getting enough oxygen, but your oxygen needs are more than they were beforehand. And the reason is that you're using more calories, so you're burning more fuel, so you need more oxygen to burn that fuel. And now you start running pretty hard, and all of a sudden you're panting, breathing as hard and fast as you can to try to get as much oxygen as you can into your body. But after a short period of time, you're going to have to slow down, because even breathing as much as you can't get in enough oxygen to burn all the fuel you need to burn to provide all the energy that your muscles need. In that case, you're doing what's called anaerobic, meaning without oxygen exercise. When you can no longer get in enough oxygen to burn enough energy, to provide enough calories to fuel what it is that your muscles are doing, your muscles have to start burning fuel in a different way without oxygen. Now, fat can't burn without oxygen. Only glucose from glycogen burns this way. We get glucose from the bloodstream, but we store glucose as glycogen. And when glucose burns without oxygen, the products are lactic acid and a very small amount of energy. This is one of the reasons you cannot do really, really hard exercise for very long. The amount of energy you get is very small. Alright? The other thing is lactic acid, that metabolic waste product, builds up. And it's what causes the muscle burn, not the second day muscle burn that you get when you've done a hard lift session, but the muscle burn you get when you're sprinting as fast as you can and your legs start to ache. That's from lactic acid. And for most people, you're in the anaerobic zone anytime you're over 85% of your maximum heart rate. But you can tell, if your breathing is labored, if you can't speak in complete sentences, if you think you're going to die, you're in your anaerobic zone.
Is this like having anything to do with why maybe when people play like cars up like before a game, like they build a bunch of pasta?
Okay. Yeah. Carving up before a game, before a race, before whatever, seems to work better for men than it does for women. The research suggests women don't really benefit from it, but guys really do. If they do a light workout, it sends a chemical signal, causes the muscles in the liver to get ready to take up a whole bunch of carbohydrates and top off all those glycogen stores. So the liver's going to fill itself as full as it can with glycogen, the muscles are going to fill themselves as full as they can with glycogen, and then the muscles have it for their use, the liver has it to release it in the bloodstream, all the cells as you're exercising. And that glycogen can be burned either aerobically or anaerobically.
Burn when you're not necessarily, when your heart rate isn't super high, you're just muscle burning when you're spending a lot of energy and pulling for electrical. Is there a relation to lactic acid with that?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, if you work an individual muscle really hard, you can have a muscle working anaerobically even though you're still breathing easily because your whole body is not working anaerobically. You can exhaust a muscle to where the heart can't get enough, even though all the other muscles don't have increased oxygen need, that one muscle does, and you can still not be getting enough oxygen to it. It won't really increase your heart rate. It will to a certain extent over time, but it won't increase it too much, and you'll still feel that hurt. And that's the lactic acid. All right. So what is the best exercise then? We've talked about aerobic, we've talked about anaerobic, we've talked about some of the benefits of each. What's the best exercise? Well, practical advice is, given that as Americans, we don't get enough exercise as it is. That's actually true not just for Americans, but most Western industrialized nations. Given that we have, for the most part, pretty sedentary lifestyles and pretty busy lifestyles, and we don't have a lot of time to exercise, and given that our access to exercise is in some cases kind of restricted, people who live in inner city can't necessarily go out and jog. They have to join a gym or something like that. The best exercise is literally the one that you will do. Whatever you enjoy doing that gets you moving, which is why even though some fitness gurus really spoke out against the general, for most people who are not athletes who are just looking to get out, benefit their heart, maybe burn some calories, build up some bone density and some muscle mass, generally aerobic is more popular than anaerobic because anaerobic hurts so darn much. You have to really want to be doing anaerobic exercise to stick with anaerobic exercise. All right? It burns more calories, it builds muscle mass faster, and it sure is important if you're trying to hit a new PR in your marathon or your 5K or whatever sport you do. But if you're just looking to stay healthy and not die, you're more likely to stick with the liquor. All right, we have the pieces of information we need now to answer a very interesting question, which is why is it when we watch the Olympics, the sprinters look like weightlifters, both the men and the women, and the marathon runners are super, super skinny looking. In both cases, the athletes have exceedingly low body fat and they're exceedingly muscular, but they have different types of muscle fiber, probably to a certain extent due to genetics and to a certain extent due to the kind of training they do. And different types of muscle fiber actually appear different from the outside person. So types of muscle fibers. This is both going to answer the question about why Olympic athletes look different, and it's going to help you make choices about the part of the bird that you want at Thanksgiving. Okay? So anyway, type 1 muscle fibers, we can also call those slow twitch fibers. The slow twitch fibers are largely aerobic. They generally like to work aerobically. You use them during endurance sports efforts. If you're running for a long distance, walking for a long distance, you also use them during endurance non-sports efforts. Any muscle that you call upon to just stay contracted, not very hard, for a really long time. Your postural muscles are mostly slow twitch. The muscles that run on either side of your spine are mostly slow twitch. Because you stand upright and those muscles have to stay flexed all day long. Those are not very powerful muscles. They're not muscles that do well if you demand that they do something very fast. If you've ever, probably most of you aren't old enough to have had this experience, but especially as people get older, if they move their backs really fast, they can pull a back muscle because the muscles just are not used to doing that. If you lift, and you've ever deadlifted too much, anybody? That sucks, right? Yeah. You expect too much of those back muscles, they're just not up for it, but they can hold you up for days on it. Type 2 muscle fibers, those are fast twitch fibers. They're largely anaerobic. They can't operate for very long because you don't get a whole lot of energy from burning sugar anaerobically, but they can put forth a very fast, very powerful effort. They're the kinds of muscles you use if you lift a really, really heavy weight. They're the kinds of muscles you're relying on if you sprint. They're the kinds of muscles that you have in the body parts that have to do fine, fast movements. Your fingers, your eyelids. Those are all fast twitch fibers. All right? They are much more powerful and much faster than type 1 fibers, but you just don't have much endurance. Everybody has a combination of both fiber types. You've got type 1s and type 2s. There are some individuals who are genetically predisposed to have more of one type than another type, and you can also train yourself to have more of one type than another type. People who are runners, you probably know at this point whether you are a fast runner and you do well at 5Ks or a slow runner who can go forever and does well at marathons. If you're a marathoner, you are not likely to ever win a 5K unless you work really, really, really hard and run in somebody else's age class, maybe against a different gender. All right? If you're a 5K runner, you can probably get yourself through a marathon, but it's going to be a darn slow marathon time where you might be used to winning in 5Ks. We have genetically a predisposition to have more of one type of fiber, but if you tend to do a lot of long distance running, you are, no matter what, you're going to build more type 1. And if you tend to do a lot of sprinting, no matter what, you're going to build more type 2. All right, what does this have to do with our Olympic athletes? The type 1 and type 2 fibers have different structural characteristics. The type 1 fibers, again, because they're so energetically dense. And because when you store fat, you can store a lot of it. It's light, it doesn't co-store with water, it takes up very little space. Type 1 fibers store fat in them and around them. Because you can store so much energy in so little space when you store fat, the muscles are actually very lean looking. It's counterintuitive. A muscle that stores fat looks lean. We're not talking fat under the skin. We're talking fat in the muscle itself, and not in huge deposits, just little bits. But fat takes up so little space that when you look at the muscle looks lean. Yeah.
Okay, so type 1, was that for marathon runners? Or?
Type 1 is marathon runners.
And
Yep.
type 2 is podcast.
Correct. Correct. The other thing is, since type 1 are aerobic, they rely on burning fuel, especially fat with oxygen, they contain myoglobin. Myoglobin has a name that sounds like a name we've heard before. Anybody know it? Hemoglobin. Hemoglobin. Myoglobin is related to hemoglobin. What does hemoglobin do?
Carries oxygen.
It's the stuff in the blood that carries oxygen from your lungs to your tissues. Perfect. Myoglobin is very, very similar. It just doesn't circulate. It stays in the muscles. Its job is to steal oxygen from the hemoglobin and keep it in the muscles for the muscles' use. So type 1 fibers store their favorite fuel. They store fat. Because fat takes up very little space, they are not bulky muscles, which makes the marathon runners look very sinewy. And the type 1 fibers contain myoglobin to help them out with their oxygen needs. Myoglobin is dark, very dark in color, so these muscles actually literally appear darker. Type 2 fibers, they operate anaerobically. These are your sprinters fibers. They store glycogen because fat doesn't do them any good. They can't burn it without oxygen, and they don't rely too much on oxygen, so they store glycogen. I mean, they still need oxygen to do their normal cellular things. They just don't burn during exercise. They don't burn fuel in the presence of oxygen to as significant an extent. So they store sugar in the form of glycogen. Glycogen is bulkier than fat, both because it's less calorically dense and because it co-stores with water. So the muscles end up pumped up with a lot of sugar and water. They are bulky looking muscles. Sprinters look bulkier. Well, this is why. Because the muscles don't rely on oxygen as heavily, they get the oxygen they need from the bloodstream. They therefore do not need myoglobin, and they appear lighter in color. So actually, we can look at a sprinter and say, hey, you must have a lot of type 1 muscle fibers, or rather a marathon runner. And a sprinter and say, you must have a lot of type 2 muscle fibers. You're very bulky, but we can also think about type 1 versus type 2 fibers in terms of nutrition. A chicken. Chickens walk around. They never run very fast. They just sort of walk around and they peck at things. And so their thighs and their drumsticks, which are the muscles of their legs, are mostly type 1 slow twitch fibers. Chickens don't have very powerful legs. They can stand and walk and do their chicken pecking thing for long periods of time. Here's what we can therefore determine about the thighs and drumsticks of a chicken. The meat is going to be dark. The meat is going to be fatty because the muscle stores fat. All right, turkeys are much like chickens. The thigh and the drumstick of a turkey are going to be dark meat, and they're going to be fattier. They're also going to be juicier because when you cook them, the fat, gives that sort of juicy texture. In any case, what we call dark meat is type 1 muscle fiber. Chickens do not fly very far. They are not migratory. There are no migratory chickens. When they fly, it's because they're panicked, and they fly about 10 feet really fast, and then they forget why they were flying, and they land. Okay? So when they fly, it's a purely anaerobic panic kind of thing. The flight muscles are not really the wing muscles. Chickens don't have a lot of wing muscles, as we know from buffalo wings. The flight muscles are the pectoral muscles, what we call chicken breast. Those muscles are light in color. They don't need to store myoglobin because they're not burning fat. They're burning glycogen, so they don't need as much oxygen. So they're light in color, and they're much, much lower in fat. As you can see here, comparing same number of grams of chicken breast and chicken thigh, way more calories in the thigh, and quite a bit more fat in the chicken thigh. nutritionists, between researchers. Some people say, look, if you know you're deficient, obviously there's something wrong with your diet. Fix your diet. Don't, turn the bottle. By which I mean the bottle. Some say, look, our diet is just going to be crappy. We're going to have deficiencies. So why not take a little bit of insurance? Okay? What do the studies show? Vitamin and mineral studies are some of the dirtiest studies out there, very dirty science, because a lot of them are sponsored by companies with vested interest in the results. But also, it can be very hard to do these studies in an unconfounded way, meaning a way where you're not getting people who are healthier, for instance, in general, are more likely to take supplements, so you have to control the studies, which that's a lot harder to do and more expensive. Anyways, if you get into the literature, here's what you'll find. For every study, its opposite is out there. It's like the Newton's law of vitamins and minerals. For every study, there is an equal and opposite, okay? One study shows folic acid decreases risk of breast cancer. One study shows it doesn't affect risk of breast cancer. One study shows vitamin E reduces risk of heart attack. Then there's a study that says, no, it has no effect on the risk of heart attack. And now there's even a new study that shows that it increases risk of heart attack. Some studies show that taking vitamin and mineral supplements decreases your risk of death. New study out of Scandinavia shows that taking vitamin and mineral supplements increases your risk of death. So, what the heck is going on? One of the things that's happening with these studies is that when you take a vitamin, when you take a mineral, first of all, if you're self-selecting, that is, if you're not being put into a study and assigned to take or not take, you're choosing to take the supplements, you could be taking vitamins and minerals because you're a healthy person who leads an otherwise healthy life, which is why in some studies, people who take vitamins and minerals have a lower risk of death. Or you could be a person who feels your health failing, and therefore you're taking the vitamins and minerals because you're scared, which is why in some studies they get results that show that people who take vitamins and minerals are more likely to die. There are lots of confounding factors. But also, sometimes vitamins and minerals in supplements aren't the same as vitamins and minerals in nature. There are many forms of vitamin E in nature. When you take a vitamin E supplement, you're taking only one form, alpha-tocopherol, which by itself seems to send a funny chemical signal and can increase risk of heart attack. So the bottom line is that the proportions, how much of each vitamin relative to the other vitamins, those proportions, as you find in nature, may be just as important as the presence or absence of the vitamin. In general, when we isolate a component of food, whether it's a single vitamin, whether it's a single nutrient like amylose out of starch, whether it's a single substance that we then chemically modify like unsaturated fat, which we partially hydrogenate to make trans fat, when we take foods, isolate them away from whatever they came packaged with in nature, and then take them or modify them and take them, we seem to get strange results, and that's shown again and again and again in the last 2 chapters. So, vitamins and minerals, definitely a good thing. Vitamins and minerals in food, really good thing.